Good evening, gentlemen. It's a very exciting class tonight. Good evening. A very exciting class. We are on the brink of really getting into the topic of chapter 1 of Tanya. We have basically finished all of the Alter Rebbe's questions. As we explained previously, most of those questions will not be answered until many chapters from now. And once you see the rate at which we're starting to go from tonight, you'll realize many years from now, probably, it's only when the answers to the questions we'll be getting. My goal for tonight's class is to read, other than the Haggah, the footnote, which we left out last week, so I'll just stick that right at the front. The goal is to read 3 words and explain them. That's the goal of tonight's class. The Alter Rebbe's questions primarily concern the nature of the tzaddik, the Rasha, and the Beinani, the different types of Jews that are categorized, the righteous, the saintly Jew, the wicked Jew, and the intermediate Jew, which are terminologies that, as we've been explaining, that come from the Talmud and other rabbinic sources, but really whose meaning is not clear. These sources all seem to be, if not in contradiction, then at least very difficult to understand, very mysterious. They seem to be coming from a perspective that knows something that the simple reader of the Talmud does not know. In other words, these readings seem to need something behind them to explain them and to make them all fit together. Our conception of what's a Beinani, for example, what is a Beinani? A Beinani can't be a person with half Averis, we said last week. In fact, a Beinani can't even be a person with one transgression. One transgression makes someone a Rasha, and one moment of tshuva makes someone a tzaddik. So how do you even have time? Where is this middle level, as we explained last week? We also said this explains why Rabbah, the great Rabbah, was a tzaddik, thought that he could be a Beinani, because a Beinani is apparently someone who doesn't even use any free moment except for Torah study, which makes the Beinani sound not so intermediate. It makes the Beinani sound very, very holy and very great, what some of us might call a tzaddik. So clearly there's more here than meets the eye. There's more to be discussed than we might assume. I'll start with a story, because why not? It's the part that everyone will remember. Rabbi Khan, Alav Shalom of blessed memory, recently passed away, and was the single greatest exponent, master, and teacher of Chabad Chassidus in this generation. He was the Rebbe's, you could say, in a sense, he was the Rebbe's primary student in the teachings of Chassidus. He was the mashpia, the Chassidus teacher and the role model, spiritual mentor of the central Lubavitch Yeshiva in 770, in world headquarters, and he was a true master of many different parts of Torah, but especially Chassidus. Chassidus was his real specialty and his real forte, and he studied it and taught it in a way that really is at least from surviving records, seems to be totally unrivaled and incomparable, probably, to anyone who's ever lived, probably, in terms of the depth of his understanding and his ability to explain to a normal human being, relatively speaking, what Chassidus is talking about and the inner meanings of the Maimarim, and the way that he he had an incredible logical grasp of the inner logic of Hasidic discourses and Hasidic teachings. I could go on and on about him, and probably anything I say wouldn't be enough. He was once teaching a Chassidus class in Lakewood, New Jersey. For those who don't know, Lakewood, New Jersey is known as a Hasidically challenged location. That's its reputation. There's not a lot of Hasidim that live there. People don't really study Chassidus there. But back in the day, Rabbi Tzvi was giving an underground Tanya shir. This was a Tanya class for students of the big yeshiva in Lakewood that would never be allowed on the yeshiva grounds, because they don't learn Chassidus in that yeshiva. But it was taught in someone's house, in someone's basement or something. They had a literally underground class to study the teachings of Chassidus, and they had the merit of learning it from Rabbi Tzvi, who was the greatest Chassidus teacher of our generation. And Rabbi Tzvi was trying to explain to them that the definitions of Tanya for tzaddik and Beinani are not the same as what you might assume. They're not the same as you might assume from a superficial reading of the sources. He said, for example, a famous example of a Beinani, the Rebbe Rashab, I believe, was the one who said that the rabbi, the great Chafetz Chaim, who I'm sure you've heard of, was a Beinani of Tanya. The Chafetz Chaim, who wrote the famous Mishnah Brura, a famous commentary on Shulchan Aruch, and also the Sefer Chafetz Chaim, which is about Lashon Hara, one of the great rabbis, especially revered in the Hasidically challenged world, was called by, I believe it was the Rebbe Rashab, a Beinani of Tanya. He was a Beinani. And this, the students in Lakewood were very insulted by him, because they said, how could you say that a Gadol Hadar, a great rabbi of his generation, one of the leaders of world Jewry, was not a tzaddik? How could you only say he was an intermediate man? And Rabbi Yoel said, well, what I mean by intermediate man, what the Rebbe Rashab meant by a Beinani, an intermediate man, not a saint, but an intermediate man, means that in thought, speech, and action, he never did anything that was against the will of God. He never had a single thought, never spoke a single word, never did a single action that was other than the will of Hashem. The students of his class were very taken aback. They said, hang on a second, let's not get so crazy. The Chafetz Chaim was a great leader of a generation, but surely he had, he had occasionally a thought to do a sin. He occasionally, he was human like us. He wasn't like God. So Rabbi Yoel said, you see the point. The point is that my Beinani is higher than your tzaddik. So don't tell me that when I'm saying he's only intermediate, it's an insult. On the contrary, this intermediate is nothing to sneeze at. Anyway, that's the story. We need to continue and figure out exactly the definition. We're going to understand in a much more rich way, even richer than the story, what is the geder, what is the definition of a tzaddik, a rasha, and a Beinani. Textually, that's why we have the next about 12 chapters of Tanya. Textually, the next 12 chapters of Tanya, including the end part of this first chapter that we're going to start learning now, is all to be able to answer and understand the difference between tzaddik, rasha, and Beinani. But in terms of our journey, in other words, not textual reasons, not technical question-answering reasons, but in terms of our journey in Tanya, which, as we know, as we discussed in many classes, our journey with Tanya is to answer questions in Avodas Hashem, is to answer questions about how can I live a more godly life, and really at a deeper level, why is it that even though I learn Torah and I do mitzvahs, it seems to not be a real and authentic connection with God? How can I have a real and authentic connection with God in my Torah and mitzvahs that permeates my heart and my mind like any worldly affection or any worldly relationship? Why do my worldly relationships and connections and disconnections seem so much more real to me than my relationship with God? And how can I fix it? Is really a different way of framing it. That's the fundamental question that the Tanya is an answer to. And in order to answer these questions, the Alter Rebbe has to rearrange our whole view of reality. Nothing short of a radical rewriting of our way, our outlook of looking at reality. And really, that's what the first 12 chapters of Tanya are. The first 12 chapters are all about who, at the broadest sense, who am I? That's really the answer, the topic of the first 12 chapters of Tanya. In different details, each chapter tackles a different aspect of that question. And by answering who I am, we also, in passing, and it's in passing for a reason, because it's less important in terms of the goal, we also explain the nature of the world and the nature of the external reality of the world around us. So the first 12 chapters of Tanya, beginning from what we start learning tonight, are the Alter Rebbe's structuring of reality, structuring of the inner reality of the soul and the outer reality of the world. Before we get to that, all I want to learn is the footnote that we skipped last week, which is really going to be sort of out of place because you're supposed to read the footnote where the footnote is inserted. We didn't have time last week, so all I want to do is read the footnote before we get started with what I wanted to learn tonight. Haggah. We're on page, in the Tanya, in the print of Tanya, it's on page 10. It says page 10, which is the second page of the first chapter in the Hebrew. In the English, it's page 4. It's the note. Umasha kasav b'zarech alek gimel, daf reish lamed aleph, kol shemu mu'atin aveinesa v'chulu, that the Zohar says in part 3 of the Zohar, page 231, that he whose sins are few is classified as a righteous man who suffers. He shailas Rav Hamnuna. This is merely the question of Rav Hamnuna le'Eliyahu to Elijah. Aval lefi tshuvas Eliyahu sham pirish tzadik v'ralei l'kumashakasav v'rayim mehem da parshas mishpatim d'le'il v'shivim panim l'teira. According to Elijah's answer, the explanation of a righteous man who suffers is, as we said before, which is that the righteous man who suffers is the one whose righteousness is not complete, right? And that he hasn't fully, he's only partially conquered the evil within him, as we discussed the Zohar to say in previous classes. And Shivim Panim l'Torah, and the Torah has 70 facets. In other words, there's lots of different aspects and perspectives to the answers of the Torah. And so, basically, what you have in the footnote is you have a question and an answer. The footnote is, why do you have trouble? Really, the question is, don't we have a source in even the Secrets of Torah, which says that a tzaddik is defined as that really all the sources we're dealing with are not dealing with the inner reality of the person, but merely a righteous person who suffers? And the answer is no, that's only the question in the Zohar, it's not the answer. Eliyahu Hanavi's answer is in accordance with what we've said in Tanya, that the entire description of tzaddik versus rasha, etc., has to do with an inner soul state. Not the most exciting footnote, but it's important to read it so we haven't skipped anything. Yes, it would have made more sense in last week's class. Sorry?
In the footnote.
Daf Reish Lamed Aleph.
Daf Reish.
Page 231. Okay. It would have made more sense in last week's class, but I thought I'd read it in this week's class. Okay. Let's learn some Tanya. Good evening. Let's learn some Tanya. Page 10. We are after the 2 dots, yes? Ach bir ha'inyan. You see it at the end of the line after the 2 dots on page 10. For anyone who wants a sefer, there's not going to be a lot of reading tonight, so if you don't have a book, I wouldn't worry about it too much. Ach bir ha'inyan. You see?
Yep.
In the English, it is the explanation, right? Last paragraph on page 4 in the English. Ach bir ha'inyan, the explanation of the matter meaning all of the last 3 classes, all the questions we've been asking, the difference between tzaddik, rasha, and beinoni, what's the nature of a Jew, and how do I have a relationship with God, etc., all together. The explanation is, where does the whole explanation start? The explanation is, al pi ma shekasav harav Chaim Vital Zal. It's according to what Rav Chaim Vital of blessed memory wrote. Rav Chaim Vital was a rabbi who lived, or the most famous part of his life anyway, lived in Tzfas, in the holy city in northern Israel, and he was the primary Talmud of the holy Arizal. He was probably the most important and influential and profound Kabbalist to ever live, except perhaps Shimon Bar Yochai in the times of the Mishnah. The Arizal is the Arizal's Shita in Kabbalah as it comes through Rav Chaim Vital. In other words, the living tradition of Kabbalah passed down from the holy Ari particularly through his student of Rav Chaim Vital, is the tradition to which Chassidus Chabad, and Chassidus in general, really the Baal Shem Tov, subscribe. And the Baal Shem Tov had a personal tradition. In other words, he had clearly, as comes down through all of the Hasidic teachings and all of the Hasidic discourses, he had his own criteria for what was the main and primary teaching of the Kabbalah, and of the Arizal in particular, and of Rav Chaim Vital even in more particular, and of what teachings were not as, so to speak, central or primary or perhaps even trustworthy.
Talking about the Baal Shem Tov.
Correct. The teachings of Chassidus. The Baal Shem Tov has a particular approach, because the fact is that if you just say Kabbalah, and the truth is that the relationship of Chassidus to Kabbalah deserves its whole own class, which God willing we'll get at some point in our study of Tanya. It's really not for now. It's a fascinating and subtle topic with lots of popular misconceptions. But the bottom line is that there's many more holy works of Kabbalah than are quoted in the works of Chassidus. Chassidus has a very rigorous and defined list, and it's a relatively very short list of works in the Kabbalah that it uses for its Kabbalistic explanations, and that it unpacks and unfolds. A very strict list, and that list, it seems, in tradition, goes back to the Baal Shem Tov. So this is just a note on some of the Kabbalistic sources we're going to see. We've already seen the Zohar and the Ramban, right? Or two other Kabbalistic sources. So the teaching, that's the basis of the whole Tanya, goes back to Rav Chaim Vital, student of the Arizal, primary student of the Arizal.
He actually wrote everything of the
Correct, the Arizal didn't write anything of himself. Rav Chaim Vital was the main scribe, not the only one. B'Shar HaKadusha, the Baal Shem Tov also didn't write, by the way. Right. Baal Shem Tov also has no writing, it's only students, right? It's according to what Rav Chaim Vital writes in Shar HaKadusha, which you could translate as the work's title is The Gate of Holiness. It's the work's title. Ube'etz Chaim Shar Nun Perek Beis, and it's also written in Eitz Chaim, which Eitz Chaim, the tree of life, is the primary, or one of the primary sources of the Arizal's teaching, written by Chaim Vital as well, transcribed by Chaim Vital. In the 50th portal, Chapter 2, the book is broken into portals. If you want to know about that, you can ask Shmuel Wolf. The L'Kol Ish Yisro, Rav Chaim Vital writes, for every Jewish person, Echad Tzadik ve'Echad Rasha, whether they are righteous or whether they are wicked, Yesh Shtei Neshamas, they have two souls. As it's written, the neshamas ani asisi, souls in the plural I have made. Isaiah chapter 57, verse 16. Now, even in these words, there's a lot to unpack. Every Jew, the foundation of the Alter Rebbe's whole teaching, the first thing the Alter Rebbe is teaching you, within Chassidus, other than questions and all the introductions we've done so far, the first thing the Alter Rebbe is teaching you within the tradition of Chassidus, really, is that every Jew, whether righteous, whether wicked, has two souls, and he brings a verse, Neshamas ani asisi, souls I have made, says God, souls in the plural. Now, the first thing I want to deal with is the technicality of the verse, because everybody's mind reacts to different things, and there are some people, some Jews, some holy Jews, who their first reaction is to ask questions on the technicalities of the verse, which I appreciate. What's the obvious question on a verse? It says, souls I have made. And we're using this to say, every Jew, whether righteous or wicked, has two souls. What's the obvious question on the verse? On this proof?
600,000 souls.
Right, 600,000 souls, exactly. In other words, yes, God, I know you made souls. There's many different people, maybe many even different things. I don't know, without context, I don't even know what it's talking about, right? But if it says souls I have made, I wouldn't assume God only made one soul. I would assume the world has many souls. And indeed, that is the pshat, that is the simple reading of the verse. However, if you go in the verse and you look what it says right before that, it says, the Spirit, that's something else. That's a different type of Jew has that question. We'll get to that in a second. The Spirit that enwraps itself is from me, is the beginning of this phrase in Isaiah. The Spirit, singular, ruach is the word. the ruach, the spirit that enwraps itself, is from me, and souls I have made. So in other words, if you actually get the full phrase, you see that there is a question on this verse. It doesn't seem to be speaking about multiple people, because it says the spirit in the singular, right? I'm talking about one spirit, and then it's described as the souls that I have made in the plural. So it turns out that each one soul, each one individual soul, more particularly, is two souls. Right? Each individual has two souls. Now, what does it mean for one individual to have two souls? It's a very good question. We'll figure that out as we go. That is the meaning of the verse. That's how Rav Chaim Vital, at the level of Seid, at the level of Kabbalah, which is different than the level of Pshat, the straightforward reading of the verse, right? He reads that contrast between the single spirit and the multiple souls as saying that each single individual has two souls. As Ronnie points out, because there are some Jews who immediately seize on this, because they know that there are different words for soul in Judaism. And in Chassidus, we generally have 5. There are 5 words for soul, and the 5 words for soul actually describe different aspects of the soul. In ascending order, the 5 words for the soul are nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida, which in their direct translation, which sometimes the direct simple translation gives you a little sense of the connotation of the word. They're all used to refer to the soul in the Torah. In their direct translation, you would translate these as nefesh is want, ruach is spirit, neshama is breath, chaya is vitality, and yechida is the unified one, or the single one, the lone one. In the feminine, by the way, which is always mentioned in Chassidus, it's the single in the feminine, yechidah, in the feminine gender.
Definition of neshama. So often neshama appears in the definition as well as the word itself.
Say again?
You try to put the definition of neshama, which is na'am chai.
Soul, I said, not neshama. Soul. The soul, there's 5 words for the soul. Right. What?
What is the translation of the word soul in Hebrew?
There's 5 translations. There's 5 translations, right? That's the point.
You don't call it soul neshama?
In casual language, maybe. That actually points to a different point you could make here, which is actually an interesting point.
For a tzaddik, you know?
Sort of. It sort of is, actually, because that's actually what the Alter Rebbe is going to say next, actually, which is you make an interesting point. I think you can even see what you're saying, in the words of the Alter Rebbe, because the next thing the Alter Rebbe says is shehein shtei nefashes, is the next words of the Alter Rebbe, that these 2 neshamas are 2 nefashes, which is a bit bizarre, because in direct translation means these 2 souls are 2 souls, right? So it's actually is kind of like what Eyal's saying. It's a bit of like who's on first, a little bit, because what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, at least the commentaries on the Tanya say, why is the Alter Rebbe saying the two neshamas, which are 2 nefashos, and from now on we're going to call the general name for these souls is going to be nefesh, which is the lowest of the 5 names, right? Which again means want, which we'll discuss in a second. What the Alter Rebbe is actually saying is like what Eyal's saying, which is that you could think that, especially someone who learns Kabbalah, like Rav Chaim Vital, that when the verse says neshamas, it means specifically the level or aspect of the soul out of the 5, which is called neshama. So the reason why the Alter Rebbe says, which are 2 nefashos, is the Alter Rebbe means to say, don't read this as in the particular, read this in the general, like Eyal says, like the simple word for soul. Right? So when the verse says, Neshamas ani asisi, souls I have made, the way Rav Chaim Vital is reading this verse, don't read it as I have made 2 specific soul aspects called neshamas. Read it as I've made 2 souls in the general term. Right? That's what these words mean. That's what the words shehein shtei nefashos. These 2 things called neshamas are the 2 general souls, and nefashos is the lowest level, which means it's the common denominator. Right? Lowest common denominator. Nefesh is what everything shares. Everything has a nefesh. So when you say a Jew has 2 souls, you mean even if you want to say that maybe the more animalistic of the souls doesn't have the level of neshama, it's still one of two nefashes. Everything has a nefesh. Yes.
Because if you look at the dictionary, probably the translation of the word soul will be nefesh.
Yes, but the dictionary really, but the dictionary really doesn't have any bearing on.
That's why I want to ask the question. So it should be actually be nefesh, not neshama.
No, not really. It's modern Hebrew. I don't know. It doesn't have any.
What do you translate soul in Hebrew?
Ruach. Why not ruach chaim?
So not nefesh?
I don't know. Eyal, you're asking me how do you translate the word soul into Hebrew? I'm telling you, there's 5 translations. Based on the Torah, there's 5 translations. What people are more commonly saying, I have no idea. It's not my responsibility. I don't know. Yes? You understand what I'm saying, though?
Yeah.
In other words, the common translation has no. The Torah has 5 words for the same thing. If you go and study the whole Torah, you'll see that it's referred to by 5 different names. So these are the.
Categories, it's not even names.
What?
Because nefesh is one thing, ruach is one thing.
Correct. It's different aspects of one thing, right? It's like you would say, I don't know. It's in language, very common, right? Like you say, the Braves bullpen has 5 arms, right? Which is called in grammar is called a synecdoche, right? Where the arm represents the whole player, right? Why do you call them arms when they're pitching? Because that's what you need for pitching is 5 arms, right? And no one actually thinks that there's only 5 arms. It means 5 whole people. That's what Alter Rebbe is saying when he says shein shtei nefashos, right? In other words, you call it neshama. Neshama can mean either the whole thing bichlalut, right? As can nefesh, by the way. Either way, they can both mean the whole thing bichlalut, depending how you use them in general, or it could mean the precise function of the soul. Yes. So it's all in how language works, really. Okay, now I get to the words that I want to read tonight. It's the 3 or 4 words I want to read. Nefesh achas mitzad haklipa. One of these souls, the one that we're going to be talking about for the rest of chapter 1, is mitzad haklipa. Comes from something that's called klipa. Now the end of the phrase is v'sitra achra, and from the sitra achra. I don't think we're even going to get to sitra achra tonight, so that we don't even need to read that far. One soul is from the klipa. For the rest of tonight, I want to discuss what these words mean. One soul is from the klipa. Now, before we even get to one soul is from the klipa, let's talk about what a soul is first, right? What do we even mean by a nefesh, right? Now, we've already run into complexity and possible sources of confusion because the soul can mean lots of different things. There's the truth. There's different levels. There's different aspects. So what we really need to do, just like the Braves in the Arms bullpen, is we need to not get rid of all of the complexity, because in the full picture you need all the complexity. But the problem is that you can't learn it with all of the complexity the first time you learn it, because then you'll never get anything, right? So the goal is we're going to simplify this whole class, and I don't just mean tonight, I mean this whole class in general is going to, in some sense, involve some simplification. We're not going to always give every detail of the whole story, because we are after the nakuda of clarity. We are after the point of what the Alter Rebbe is saying. The single, why is the Alter Rebbe saying this? What's the connotation of each word that he uses? We want to be able to translate the text and actually understand what each word of this text says, right? Which can be harder than you think, because when you say, what's a nefesh, and someone tells you soul, you say, what's a soul? And they say, I have no idea. What's a soul? So, we already gave translations for 5 levels of the soul, which are more or less kind of, sort of useful, right? You had the nefesh was want, ruach, spirit, neshama, breath, right? Breath from the famous, as we're going to see in chapter 2, Alter Rebbe discusses the famous blowing into the nostrils of Adam, the breath of life, right? And by the way, in many cultures across the world, the word for soul derives from the word for breath. In ancient Greek, for example, the soul was the pneuma, like you would say a pneumatic pump, right? Same root, it's all from air, breath, right? And there's a certain deep wisdom to that. Air, as we're going to see in this chapter later, is one of the 4 classical elements, which we'll probably have a whole class just on what that means. But there's a connection between air and breath, and there's lengthy Hasidic discourses, pitting different metaphors for the soul one against the other. Because elsewhere in Tanya, like way later, we're going to say that the soul is more like a candle, right? Whereas in other places, the very name of soul seems to say more like it's air. And fire and air are 2 fundamentally different elements in the 4 elements of the Torah. And so there's long Hasidic discourses pitting these metaphors against each other. In what sense is the soul like air? In what sense is the soul like fire? Etc., which is very, very interesting and detailed, and God willing, we'll try and get to a lot of that as we go. And then, of course, you have the Chaya and Yechida, which, as the 2 higher levels of the soul, have much less concrete definitions. Chaya is vitality. What is life is a very good question. You should ask a scientist and see how complicated the answer is. You have what is Yechida? Yechida is unity in the feminine, whatever that means, right? One thing we are not discussing, maybe it would help to say what we're not discussing, right? When we say the Jew has 2 souls, there are 2 classical and very well-known for a good reason, because they're found universally throughout the Talmud and the Midrash and all the ancient rabbinic sources. There's a concept called Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara, which everyone learns about in Hebrew school. You have the good inclination, the bad inclination, right? You have the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other. And this one says do good, and this one says do bad. The Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara, the inner inclination to do the right thing and the wrong thing, or to do, more correctly, to do the difficult thing or the wrong thing, right? In more practical terms, right? There's the 2 voices. One says you should do the difficult thing, and one says you should do the wrong thing, which is always the easier thing, right? Those are the 2 inclinations. The Alter Rebbe is specifically not talking about Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara. And the difference is subtle, but once you get the difference, you'll see that it's actually a subtle difference that turns everything on its head in a way. What reality are the 2 inclinations dealing with, right? Because let's say the Talmud is nigla de Torah, as Chassidus would call it, the revealed aspect of the Torah, which doesn't mean that it's exoteric and it's easier to understand what it means, versus the Kabbalah and Chassidus, which are esoteric, and the hidden wisdom of the Torah are harder to understand what they mean. That's not the only implication of the term revealed and hidden aspects of the Torah. You also have the implication that the revealed aspect of Torah deals with and is transforming and speaks to revealed external realities. In other words, the revealed Torah, it's not that the Torah itself is revealed, like it was handed out on flyers. That's not the only implication. The other implication is it's talking to revealed things that are explicit. Whereas the hidden Torah, it's not that it was kept away and not taught to anyone, although that's also true, but the other implication of the hidden Torah is that it speaks to realities that are below the surface, right? Hidden realities, implicit realities. And here you see a clear difference. The revealed Torah talks about a good inclination and a bad inclination. What are they inclinations toward? When we say good inclination, bad inclination, right? Yetzer Tov, Yetzer Hara, right? Each one is speaking to you to try and get what? What's the end goal?
What's good for them?
What?
What's good for them?
No, it's good for, I don't even know what that means.
That's what
It's the ego.
What? The good inclination and the bad inclination, what do they want? When they speak to you, this voice, when you have the angel on one shoulder, right? As you learn in Hebrew school, you have the angel on one shoulder, right? And the little devil on the other shoulder. We don't believe in the devil, but you have little Yetzer Hara on the other shoulder.
do what's right, do what's wrong.
Do what's right, do what's wrong, right? Simple things here, right? Their fight is over behavior. Their fight is do the right thing, do the wrong thing, right? Do the mitzvah, obey, or transgress, right? Assuming, of course, that who we are obeying is God and the ultimate truth, the ultimate reality, of course, right? Then the disagreement is obey, disobey, right? That's the fight. The fight is over your action and your behavior. And Yiddishkeit, as traditionally understood, Judaism as traditionally understood, from the revealed part of the Torah, Judaism as it deals with the revealed world, in other words, is an action-obsessed religion. Judaism is profoundly interested in the actions and behavior of a person, right? It's not about what's on the inside, it's about what you do. What you do is very important and goes a long way towards defining who you are as a person to a large extent. As the Talmud says, and as the Lubavitcher Rebbe repeated thousands and thousands of times, the action is the main thing, right? On the other hand, the inner Torah, which speaks to inner and implicit realities, does not speak of the evil inclination and the good inclination. And by the way, the Alter Rebbe in this is not original. Alter Rebbe is working, and the Baal Shem Tov as well, are working off earlier Kabbalists and earlier sources, although they made this into they would be the first one to say this is the first thing you should learn as the most basic foundation. They made it into the central pillar and the central theme of the whole story. Although they are working there, the idea is not original to them. It was not revealed by them the first time. There are older works of Kabbalah where this is discussed. Many of the details of this dynamic are discussed. In Chassidus, in the inner Torah, you have not two inclinations which are seeking to control the person's behavior. You have two souls, which, as we're going to see in chapter 9 of Tanya, God willing, which are fighting over the entire life of the person. In other words, they are not the disagreement, the problem, the fight is not over what you're going to do. The fight is actually over who you are. That's the subtle yet profound difference of viewing it as two souls rather than two inclinations. Two inclinations means you are who you are. The fight is, which way are you going to go, really? Right? You stand at a crossroads, famous metaphor. Which way are you going to go? Which way are you going to pass, right? You have one voice which is, in the ultimate and truest sense, trying to perpetuate your being, which is the Yetzer Tov. It's trying to make you the most perfect version of who you are and try and send you down that path, right? And then you have the Yetzer Hara, which it says in the Gemara, Hu HaMalach HaMaves, right? Is the Yetzer Hara is trying to destroy you, right? Is a force of self-destruction, the force of self-destruction within man, which you can see written all over every page of every newspaper. And it makes much better news than the Yetzer Tov, by the way. But it might just be more common. I'm not sure who's to blame. But the Yetzer Hara wants to destroy you, more or less. The human tendency towards self-destruction. And the only question is, which path are you going to go down? The Alter Rebbe and Chassidus, pardon?
Why does it have to be that way?
Why does what have to be what way?
When the Yetzer Hara wants to destroy you.
As opposed to? Why have a Yetzer Hara? Why do we have a Yetzer Hara in general?
Well, we have that because if you don't have that, you only have the Yetzer Tov.
Right.
Go down the route.
Right, so what's the question?
Maybe the Yetzer Hara is there to prevent us from going all the way
No.
in one direction.
Not in Judaism anyway. Not in Judaism anyway. In Judaism, the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Hara is not the place for moderation. That's not although, whatever, it's obviously more complicated than I'm letting on, but ultimately, no. Ultimately, the Talmud says, and the Talmud says this explicitly, I forget where, that the Yetzer Hara literally wants to destroy you. The Yetzer Hara and the angel of death, it says, and the accuser in the heavenly court are all the same being. That's what it says in the Talmud. It's not even Kabbalah, right? So in other words, the voice which tells you, eat the cheeseburger, and the angel of death who comes and says, you ate the cheeseburger, I guess it's time to go. And then after you die, when you go to the heavenly court, the accuser who says, this guy ate a cheeseburger, right? It's all the same guy, which actually makes it kind of, although very dark, almost a very humorous Gemara, right? Because the person thinks that they're eating the cheeseburger and this is going to be so great, right? And the very voice which tells you to eat the cheeseburger is the very voice which is going to bring it up at your trial, right? It's the very prosecutor. It's interesting and fascinating Gemara. Long story short, it's the angel of death. The voice, it's a voice of destruction. It wants your death. It doesn't want your prosperity. Now, it's difficult to see that And that's the whole trick, right? That's the difficulty. The difficulty is that when it comes to you, it doesn't come to you and sound like it's the angel of death, obviously. There wouldn't be much of a decision then. Chassidus says a radically different thing. It doesn't say you're one person with two choices at a crossroads, right? Chassidus says you actually are deciding which person you are, which is hard to explain without, that's why we're going to have multiple classes to try and explain what this means. You're actually trying to decide what person you are, not in the sense of if you go down one road that'll make you into a different person, which is also true, right? We mean it much more profoundly, much more from the inside, right? In other words, it's more a decision. Who you are in Chassidus is more of a decision, who do you belong to, in a sense, right? In other words, not what choices do you make, although that's obviously also vitally important, and on the contrary, Chassidus's point is actually to make the actions even more important than they are in the other way, just in a different route, a different way of approaching it, and we'll get to all of that when we talk about mitzvahs, which is later, not so far later that you have to be here for years. That we'll get to hopefully relatively quickly. But the question is not which way do I go? The question is, what is I a manifestation of? What do you mean by I? That's really the question, right? The fight between the Nefesh HaBahamis and the Nefesh HaLokis is over who is the I going to be. The fight between the animal soul and the godly soul, the soul that's from Klippa, as we're going to explain, and the soul from holiness, is over who am I going to be, in a profound sense, not just what I'm going to do, but at the very core of my being, who am I going to be? And we're going to discuss what that difference is, what the two options are. That's what the Alter Rebbe is going to proceed to discuss. Yes?
Doesn't that, obviously change from moment to moment and day to day, because we're bending, we flip flop, we're right on the edge. And
correct.
Sometimes we lose.
Correct.
Sometimes we win.
Right.
So it doesn't mean we're one person and another person, or it doesn't.
No. On the contrary, that's part of what makes this quite difficult. It's tricky because first of all, the Alter Rebbe has already said both the righteous and the wicked have both, right? So in other words, the question of who you are is not that transit between today I'm having a day of repentance, let's say, and yesterday not so much, right? What we're saying is that external change of who which is a question of who I am on some level, for sure, because again, Judaism believes very much that our actions to a large extent do define and change and affect who we are, right? The question is, are those changes, when we have those changes and one soul has control, right, so to speak, is that something that is only really manifested in external manifestation, or is that a profound change in the inner state of the person? And the Alter Rebbe's point, and the whole perspective we're going to go from, is exactly backwards. Backwards from what we would assume is Judaism, so to speak. The behaviorist position is not really true. What we would call in modern psychology the behaviorist position, where we judge the person solely by what comes in. We treat the person like a black box, right? Stimulus goes in, response comes out. We don't know what happens in between. So that's the exact opposite of Chassidus' approach, the opposite. Stimulus and response are all the way at the surface level. They're up here, and they are important, vitally important, but they're not important because they're the true inner reality of the person. They're important because the whole point of the battle of the inner reality is to manifest on the surface. All different understanding, but that's it in a nutshell. So it's really a question of when we say it's a question of who I am, we mean there's a fundamental inner soul state where that's like one soul. One soul has the reins, and it's the body they're fighting over as well, right? Because there's only one body. We'll get to all of that in chapter 9, God willing. So, one soul is from Klippa. One soul, this is going to be the animal soul. The rest of the first chapter discusses what's called in casual Chabad parlance, the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul. Though as we see it will have other names and other ways of describing it. The first soul is from Klippa. Klippa is going to be a bad thing, a negative thing. Why do we talk about the bad soul first, so to speak?
Dominant.
It's not really bad, first of all. We don't call it the wicked soul, we call it the animal soul. Why do we talk about the, let's put it this way, why do we talk about the non-godly soul first?
Because it's
Bad news
more.
Sorry?
Bad news first.
Bad news first, I like
That's
that.
who we live with every day.
That's who we live with every day, another good answer.
The God is our sin.
But you would think maybe you would say the opposite. Maybe the Torah should speak to the higher reality, and then the one we live with every day should be second. Maybe the Torah should give it to us in the most optimistic or positive way possible. Maybe good news first. Maybe there's room to say maybe. So the commentaries on Tanya there's two common answers. One answer is very simply that it's actually the chronological experience of a human being, because in Chassidus it's explained, the Kabbalah it's explained that the godly soul, which we're going to talk about in chapter 2, only fully enters the person at the age of majority, at bar bas mitzvah. It begins at bris, right, as a very young baby, right, or for a girl around the same time at the baby naming, but it only completely is in its full fighting form, right, at the age of majority, which is one of the reasons why in the Midrash and in Chassidus both, the wicked inclination is compared to an old but foolish king, whereas the good inclination is compared to a wise child, right? And elsewhere in Chassidus it even uses the metaphor, it says it's like a small child and like a rampaging beast, like a wild ox, right? And the whole idea is that the ox is much more powerful and the ox is much older, right? You have a 1-year-old fighting a 13-year-old, really, when you're 13 or 14, right? But the advantage is that the child has intellect and the child can make a plan, whereas the ox can't make a plan, right? And that's why you see all the time children riding wild, dangerous beasts, because the beasts can be tamed and can be saddled and be made even safe for a child to ride them, right? Although contests of direct strength would not be advised. But we'll get to all of that. Later. So one answer is that it's chronological. A second answer is that even the godly soul, in a sense, its purpose here in this world and in our lives is to deal with the animal soul. So the animal soul is really where most of the action takes place, because the main thing we're here to deal with is not in the godly soul. The godly soul is good. The godly soul's whole problem and the only reason we would even mention the godly soul, because really it's good on its own, its whole problem is the animal soul. So in a sense, both of them are for the animal soul. The animal soul is interested only in the animal soul, and the godly soul also, when it's here, is only interested in the animal soul. So in a sense, the animal soul, because that's where the fight is, so to speak, so the animal soul is mentioned first. Those are the two commentaries. What do we mean by klipa? In 15 minutes. Klipa and Sitra Achra will be discussed later more in chapter 6. So we'll get inside a lot of what I'm saying now. We'll see in the words of the Alter Rebbe himself, very terse words, but his own definitions later. But I'm going to give it to you outside in order to appreciate what's going on right here. The animal soul, the first soul that a person has, is from Klipa. And it's called a nefesh. It's called a want. Nefesh in Rabbinic Hebrew means want, desire. Like the famous phrase from the Gemara, mima nafshach, which means like either way you want it, right? Nefesh means a want, a will. And the will comes from Klipa. So, once upon a time, to understand what Klipa is, once upon a time, there was only God in Judaism. Judaism says, once upon a time, there was only God. There was nothing else. Where was God before he began to create? Wrong and wrong. Incorrect. Everywhere. Decent, but not what I'm looking for.
There's no change between.
He was here.
The answer is that there was no where before God began to create.
Yeah.
That's the answer I'm looking for. Where, God being somewhere, is a function of the creation. What?
What's the difference between where and everywhere? It's the same.
No, because there was no everywhere for God to be. There was only God.
Wow, but that means like everywhere.
No.
There's no where.
There's nowhere. There's no space. Space everywhere is a spatial term. It's a spatial term. It means there's a place for something to be. When there was just God, there was no place for something to be. There was just God. God obviously is not spatial. There's no where, right? I've told you before, there was a famous great Christian philosopher, when someone asked him what God was doing before he created the world, he said he was preparing hell for people who ask questions like that. Thankfully, that's not our approach in this class. Most of the time. There was no where before God began creating. This point is extremely, extremely important because it means that anywhere, and what I mean by where is any context whatsoever, not just physical space, but even what we call spiritual space, which means intellectual context, right? In the way that you would say 2 + 2 = 4 is closer to the Pythagorean theorem than Paris is the capital of France, if you followed my sentence. Right? There's spiritual space. There's a relation between even spiritual things which don't have any physical space. There's still a certain dimensionality. There's closer, there's further. In Kabbalah, this derives from what's called the Kav, which we'll discuss a different time. There's context, dimensionality, space, even in the spiritual term. God is beyond all of these. Space, and even the concept of context itself is a creation in Chassidus. It doesn't exist to God himself. Before God began creating, before God created anything, there was no everywhere, there was no context, there was no place to be. God in Judaism is not contextualizable. There is no context or frame that surrounds God, because if there was, that context or frame would be at least another God, if not a more prior and a better God than God. Yes, it is fundamental to Judaism that there is nothing that you don't contextualize God. God only contextualizes you. It's a one-way street, and that's what makes him God. If you look up what is God in the first law of Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, of the laws of the Rambam, he would tell you he is the first existence from which the truth of all other existences derive. No other existence is as true as his truth. If all of them cease to exist, he would exist, but if he ceased to exist, none of them would exist. Everything depends on him, he depends on no one. Now, even these words, they depend on him, he depends on no one, even these words can be read in different ways. Chassidus and Kabbalah, the way of the Baal Shem Tov, is absolutely radical. In fact, I had a rabbi once who told me that all of the deep, rich, intellectual tradition of Chassidus is just to help an intelligent adult reach the same place that a child in Hebrew school has already reached. The child in Hebrew school is already there. It's radical because it's radical like the simplicity of a child, yes? Now the problem is that a person who's not a child, and also a person who has to intellectually internalize this idea, can't just take it with the simplicity of a child, because then it's a lie, right? So in other words, you have to be complicated to be simple, which is fundamental to the Alter Rebbe's whole view of the universe. The goal is to be simple, but the only way to actually truly be simple is to get a little complicated. Right, is to work, or to, in other words, to understand, to actually understand with your mind. So, when we say that everything is dependent on God and God is dependent on nothing, right? Most people walking around the world today, if you tell them about God, even if they believe in God, even if they say God exists and God is the creator, they think of God as another being within the same shared universe that they are. There's a universe. You don't mentally place an edge on it, right? When I say universe, you don't think of something with walls, right? You think of something that seems to extend outward indefinitely. I don't know whether that's allowed or not. Philosophers have struggled with that, what that means, that it could even extend outward indefinitely. But there's a certain context, right, that you call the universe. There's a certain reality. And if you believe in spiritual realities, you would include the spiritual universe, spiritual realities, not just physical, obviously, but spiritual, mental, however you want to categorize and slice up all of the realities, which people who have common sense would include spiritual realities. People who have educations pretend that spiritual realities don't exist. It's a different discussion for a different time. We've already had it, I think, at least mentioned it twice in these classes so far. Not again. So these, you have the universe, and then there's God, who's somewhere out there, and okay, maybe he doesn't have a body, maybe he's spiritual, but he's somewhere out there, and I'm over here, and we're two beings. I understand incommensurate beings. I'm so small, and he's so unfathomably large and unfathomably perfect, etc., etc. But ultimately, they're both in the frame, even if you don't use a frame, right? In other words, they're both within one context, right? Ridiculous. Not Judaism, not even other forms of monotheism. Never mind Judaism. The one God that Abraham believed in was never like this. This is called a really big and strong idol in Judaism. That's the correct terminology for such a conception of God. God is not another being within a broader context, right? And the reason why is very simple. Because why am I worshiping this being instead of the context? The context is bigger, right? The context is stronger. This context can contain me plus this being. So it has something more than the being. It has the being plus me, right? So maybe that should be God. And what if you have a broader context than that, which includes even those contexts? So then that is the greatest, the ultimate being, in which all other beings are grounded. This is why all philosophers of monotheism, since Abraham himself, the original monotheistic philosopher, have known that God is not something that fits within the frame. God is something much more like the canvas itself, right? God is being itself, right? He isn't a being, right? He's much more like being itself. It's much more like the canvas or the ground or the context on which everything else is written, which is what Maimonides, which is what the Rambam means when he says that everything depends on him, but he depends on nothing. Right? In other words, it's the highest, it's the ultimate thing. He is the context. He is the ultimate context. Anything that exists, anything that has mitzias, is the word of the Rambam, right? Derives from the truth of his mitzias. So it's the ultimate true being, which is very much like being itself. What it means to be, right, is to partake of the reality of Hashem. That's what the Rambam describes himself. La halacha, in Jewish law, not a fancy Kabbalah understanding. Right? In Jewish law, God is the ultimate being, and every other being is derivative of his truth. That doesn't mean he creates them and they go somewhere else. It means that their very existence is a substrate or is consequent to, is constantly dependent on his being. So he's much more like the canvas. Just like you can't have a picture without something to paint it on, you can't have any particular that exists without existence itself, without God. God is the ground. So everything that fits within, everything that you would put in the frame is dependent on God. It's not God, right? God is the ground of all things, right? Chassidus is even more radical. Chassidus says that God is the being beyond being, which means that existence itself is actually a creation relative to God, which is very radical. Very radical, and for reasons that would take a very long time to go into in this class, so we won't go into them, not a position that a philosopher can hold. It's only a position that you could hold as a Kabbalist with a received tradition. In other words, the only reason you would think this is because the Torah told you so. There's no reason logically to assume this. What is it again? It's that existence itself is a creation. God lowers himself down to even make the thing that we call the existence. So God isn't even the canvas. God is not part of the picture at all, God himself. Obviously, everything in the picture is absolutely dependent on God. What I mean is that he's not on the table. He's not one of these things we're talking about. He's not even existence. He's beyond existence. He transcends the concept of existence, the distinction between existing and not existing, which we've discussed in this class before, right? He's the non-existing existence. He exists in a way beyond normal existence. Why am I bringing up all of these very lofty philosophies? Because it's important to understand what klipa is, believe it or not. Because all existence, and if you don't have this when you learn Tanya, it's like you can learn it, but you're just off target. You don't get the point, right? All existence, everything that we know, right? Everything that we love, everything that we see as our reality, exists within godliness, right? Including existence itself, the very concept of to be, right? These are all creations within godliness. These are all contextualized by God, right? God is not among, so to speak, the list of all of these things. He's not even the defined as the pure, limited to being, the highest existence, right? God is beyond all of these things in Chassidus, and everything that is just an expression of God. So in other words, why there's no baseline existence. That's the point I'm making. Right? In other words, there's no existence lying around for something to just partake in. If you understand the gist of what I'm saying, everything that is ultimately contextualized by God. God himself is the baseline. Everything else derives from and exists within godliness. So there is, in the view of Chassidus, there is no such thing as to simply exist. Not even God himself is to simply exist. To simply exist is an act and a will of God. So everything that exists, there is no just existing. It's not like you'll go around and you see a thing happens to be here. Oh, this is here. It must exist, right? That is the exact opposite of the way Chassidus looks at the world. Chassidus looks at the world from the inside rather than the outside, which is a different way of saying from the source rather than the effect. We, spoiler alert, we meaning in our animal soul, right? We look at existence as a given, right? The world exists, God is somewhere else. He's a question, right? Chassidus is the exact opposite. God is the given, right? God is before anything exists, and everything that exists is purely and only by the will of God. So in other words, there's no option for something to exist other than God, right? You understand what I'm saying? There's no existence to partake in. It's not an available resource, except when God decides to create it. So everything that exists, therefore, must be an expression of God, right? In other words, there is nothing that exists. There's no existence available outside of God. So when this thing has come to exist, when this water bottle has come to exist, what is it existing on? It's existing only on the will of God. The very concept of existence does not exist unless God wills it, which, yes, is a bit paradoxical, and that's the problem of trying to think about God for too long, as you start running into, right? That's what Chassidus says. So in other words, if you run into something and it exists, oh, God wanted this to be here, right? God made this be here. And whatever it is derives from that initial state when nothing exists but God. So, this brings us to klipa. Again, we're inching our way there. existence itself is an expression of God. In Chassidus and Kabbalah, we say that existence is the Ein Sof, ultimately. The Ein Sof is the highest existence, the infinite one. We mean the expression of the Ein Sof, not God himself, who again is beyond existence, for a different class. How do I get existences, right? So existence is like the canvas, right? So you have something called the Ein Sof, which in the standing on one leg, and the shortest possible definition is it's the fullest expression of everything that God is, and that's what existence itself is. Don't ask questions because I don't know if I could answer them in less than an hour. So the how do you get from existence to existences? Working down from God, right? God emanates, he shines a light that becomes existence itself. How do you get to individual existences, right? The answer is, so you need something to divide up this existence, because now I want to parcel out existence into particular packages. I want this water bottle and this laptop and these keys, right? So you can't just have more existence, because existence is undifferentiated, because it reflects the simplicity of God. So what God does is he withholds existence. And that's the other, it's like a binary language. That's the fundamental 1 and 0 of all reality, is God granting existence, which is again just self-expression, and self-concealment. The self-concealment of God allows there to be gaps, right? It's not just 1, there can be 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, right? It's not just the being of God, there can now be different beings that are defined and separated out by subtracting the total divine revelation in a process which is called tzimtzum. This is all very abstract, I know, but it's actually good to know how abstract it can get, because it reminds us with what humility we must approach these things. So you have divine revelation and divine self-concealment. Divine revelation and divine self-concealment are, according to Chassidus, the DNA, the fundamental building blocks of all reality, right? God, there's something called the 10 spheres, which are the 10 modes in Kabbalah of divine self-expression, which are 10 lights in 10 vessels, right? Which means there's 10 modes of divine self-expression with 10 modes of divine self-concealment filtering them, more or less. And this is the baseline and the building block of all our reality. Everything we have described in this whole scheme, in this whole picture, from God down through self-expression and self-concealment of God, which allows the creation of everything, all of this that we're describing is all what we would call in Chassidus Kedusha, is what we describe in Chassidus holiness. Holiness means, in the sense of consecrated to God. Every one of these expressions, every one of these manifestations is, it has what's called in Chassidus dvekus. It cleaves to God. It's attached to God. In other words, even when God is concealing himself, it's a concealment that's also godly, as we explained to great length actually in what we were learning before we started learning Tanya, right? It's like it's like the shell of the tortoise, right? That even the concealment is part of the being itself. So, none of this yet is klippa. All of this is holiness. So what is reality so far? Reality so far in this picture is not what we think reality to be. We think of reality as there's an objective existence out here in the world outside of me. I am an observer within this objective existence, right? I'm a one human being. I look out from these eyes, so to speak, at this objective shared reality. And that's what reality is. And wherever God is, he also looks out on this objective shared reality. In one sense, I'm looking at this water bottle, and God, from wherever he is looking at this water bottle, right? If that's the non-Chassidic way of thinking about it. That is the external or the superficial way that reality works. What we're saying is on the contrary, There is no other perspective. There is no other perspective than God's. God's is the only perspective on all reality, right? If you want to ask where do the other perspectives come from, we're getting to that in a second. But according to the picture we've just built, there really is only one perspective on reality. There's God, and God sees himself either as revealed or concealed. And that is the means by which everything is created. So God creates the world as described in the Torah, and God creates something called the Garden of Eden. You have in the Garden of Eden, you have Adam and Eve. And of course, you have at the same time, according to Kabbalah, you have something called a world of klippot. You have a world of klippa. A klippa literally means a peel or a shell, right? Like a walnut shell or a banana peel in Hebrew is called a klippa. God creates a world full of peels and or shells. What are peels and or shells? A peel or a shell is the idea that the divine self-concealment, when God hides himself to allow other existences to come into being, the divine self-concealment actually becomes and descends into or degrades into an affirmative concealment of God, right? I'll say it again. The act of divine self-concealment gives way to and becomes, in its ultimate and its lowest expression, an actual concealment of God. You see the difference? There's an act of divine self-concealment. The act of divine self-concealment is holy, right? There's nothing, it's no less godly than the act of divine self-expression. These are the tools whereby God lends existence and gives out, parcels out existence to other realities, right? Such as Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. However, there is such a thing as the divine self-concealment when God hides himself becoming an actual concealment of the divine, which is a different way of saying it's no longer just from God's perspective. There is now another perspective. That's klippa. The shell is the concealment of the divine. But when we mean concealment, we mean not just that it hides over the divine, which is part of the act of creation, which is holy in itself. We mean it's actually become a separate, independent perspective. There's now other eyes that look out on the universe. There's now, not only has existence been parceled out by God, but God has given out through the ultimate act of self-concealment. It's like the author hid himself from his book, right? It's like the author hid himself from his own story. And the story now thinks that it has its own perspective, right? There's no author anymore. There's no ultimate perspective that is telling this story. There is now a reality which is called a shell reality or a peel reality, a reality of klippa, and which is separate from Hashem. Now,
Quantum physics.
What?
Quantum physics.
I don't know what that means. But now there's a. This is all before the sin, right? Before the sin of eating from the tree, these realities which have forgotten God were also not a bad thing before the eating from the tree, and they didn't exist in the same reality as everything else. In other words, there was a separate reality for klippas that God created, for shell realities, a separate perspective from God, and even that wasn't a bad thing. That too was just an expression, was even in its concealment, and even in its forgetting the divine, even that was just an extension and an expression of the divine.
So what's the purpose before the sin?
What?
What's the purpose of creating it before the sin?
Because the purpose of creating it is, as I believe the Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek says, he says that the shell doesn't just conceal the nut; it also protects the nut, right? In the metaphor of the word klippa, of a shell, right? So the shell, in its original, in the good reason that God creates it, right? It actually exists to protect. Now, I'm not sure exactly what that means. Yeah, it doesn't mean protect. Protect is just a metaphor, right? What it means is that it serves the purpose of the thing, right? Like, for example, like we say in Chassidus all the time, clothes, as the Alter Rebbe is about to say a few years from now, not clothes. When the clothes, right, his lavshus, when you say clothes, right, the clothes express the person. They're not purely for the purpose of concealment, right? They also express the person. They're also part of the person's self-expression, the way the person is in a context, is in their world, right? So the klippa once served the same purpose, right? In other words, it was just the most external expression of God, the way clothes are to a person, right? They serve a positive purpose. They protect the person. They allow the person to be expressed. And now you're going to say, but the clothes is actually something totally different, right? Yes, the same way the klippa was once totally different from the divine reality, right? Adam and Eve eat from the tree. They have the sin of Eitz Hadas. I guess we'll have to stop the story here, kind of in the middle tonight. We're way over time. I don't want to. I have to. Adam and Eve eat from the tree, and what happens is that this world of a separate reality from God, a separate perspective from God, collides with all the other realities. In other words, what was once kept separate, what the clothes that once knew they were only clothes, were then invited to come and pretend to be people, right? Or to be true selves. In other words, when Adam and Eve eat from the tree, it's the tree of Das, right? Das in Chassidus means the uniting of separate realities. That's really what Das is. Knowledge, translated normally as knowledge. Knowledge is the faculty that unites multiple worlds, multiple different separate perspectives and realities. So when Adam and Eve eat from the tree of good and evil, right, what do? They united the realities of good and evil, which is a different way of saying.
But it was the opposite, to differentiate between good and evil.
Yes and no. That's a good point. I will deal with the point and then class will be over. They ate from the tree of good and evil. What they actually did was unite good and evil, but
That doesn't make sense.
before eating from the tree, as I said before, the klippas had a separate reality. So in other words, like in the Garden of Eden, eating from a cheeseburger would be like sticking your hand into a fire now, right? People don't go around and have agonizing moral decision-making and questioning the tradition of their forefathers, whether they should stick their hand in a fire or not, right? People sticking their hands in fires, this is generally just not something people want to do because it's immediately painful. You see that it was a bad idea, right? It's damaging to the person, and it's painful for that reason, and therefore we don't do it. Before the eating from the tree of good and evil were known in this way. In other words, the will of God, which if you think about it is exactly what I've been saying the whole class, right? There is only the perspective of God, right? Klippa, external realities, right? So to speak, a reality that denies God, a reality that doesn't know that it's a divine reality, right? These things were separate from the reality in the garden. The garden it wasn't something that entered into it. It's like in your reality, there's no sticking your hand into fire in your reality, unless something very wrong with you, right? There was it wasn't a question. There's no real decision between sticking your hand in a fire, not sticking your hand in a fire, right? So too, the klippa was known to be only a shell. It was known to be only superficial. It's not. We know that there's the author. We see the author. We see that everything that exists is merely an expression of the author, of the one divine perspective, and that existence itself is merely the creation of God. And this is all patently obvious. So how could there be? What purpose would denying God do? It's like sticking your hand in a fire. Eating from the tree, as the Zohar says, it opened their eyes. The Torah says they opened their eyes, but the Zohar says they opened their eyes to the blindness of this world, right? In other words, they began to see, and what did they see? They saw blindness.
Blindness or even?
Blindness.
Because, they were naked before, and it didn't bother them. Only when they ate from the tree,
Yes.
they realized they're naked.
Yes, correct. It opened their eyes, as the Zohar says, they opened their eyes to the blindness of this world, which means that all of a sudden, the Klippa and God gained equal footing in this reality, which means that good and evil suddenly became a choice that could be decided between objectively, using the objective intellect. It's not like sticking your hand in a fire, right? It's actually a decision. Do I want to do this or do I want to do that? Morality is not like sticking your hand in a fire nowadays.
Right.
That started when they ate from the tree. Moral decisions became decisions that are decided only intellectually, which is a different way of saying that the eating from the tree was the act that created the objective intellect in our reality. The objective intellect, in other words, the view from nowhere, right? The intellect which tries to see the world not as a person, right? But tries to see it purely as it is, not attached to a perspective, was created by eating from the tree. Because before the eating from the tree, there were no other perspectives except God's perspective. Eating from the tree created and said, it made a collision, right? It mixed good and evil in the sense of that other perspectives now came and claimed that were also valid perspectives.
Competing.
Before, they were locked away in a separate reality in the world of the Klippas, right? There was a separate reality where they existed. Nobody knew about them. They didn't bother anyone. They weren't a real concern, right? The eating from the tree brought into the world that these other perspectives might be equally valid, right? Yeah. Equally valid to God's perspective, which is why the klippa is called a shell or a peel, right? Because what's the shell or the peel? The shell or the peel means it only has an outside, not an inside, right? Its whole definition is outside. That's what it is. It's an outside. It's an outside part, right? So, that's what an outside does, right? So an outside part, a part that's truly defined as an outside, right, means, in other words, a perspective which denies the only source of true reality. That's the outside, right? The only way to get away from God being the only true reality, right, is to look at everything from the outside. Is look at everything superficially as it develops, right? That's how you end up as a human being walking along and seeing a water bottle and saying, oh, look, this thing just exists. Instead of, oh, this is the manifest will of God, this right here, and could be nothing else, and is only purely an expression of God because there is no other existence available. This is what you would know if you saw it in Gan Eden, right? But because since the eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the divine perspective and the klippa perspective are fighting over this reality that we live in. They fight over, so to speak, the objective mind, the objective world, the body, the physical world as well, right? That's klippa. One soul is from the klippa. And we'll discuss this more next week. I feel like I didn't do a very good job explaining it, but we'll try again, God willing, next week.